okay with that. Okay, it says it's recording. Crossing fingers. So we're going to talk about breathing today. And I don't teach breathing workshops all that often because it's kind of like if somebody, if you wanted to teach digestion, if somebody came to my studio and said, I have digestive issues, what do you suggest? I can advise them as to the quality of their input, meaning the nutrition. And then in terms of the output, I can affect that by teaching them the role of abdominal tension in affecting the digestive process. So I would give them things like abdominal release, psoas release. I would work on the pelvic floor with some squat protocol, and then maybe give them a squatty potty, which is a squat platform that you use on the toilet. And barring any kind of disease or pathology, that should help the digestion become more optimal. So breathing is a little bit like that. I think that most of us have been digesting and breathing for several decades already, optimally enough to maintain this quality of life that we're currently in. So we have this interest in breathing, but really what my role is to look at the mechanics of breathing. So I won't be teaching you things like breathing, like pranayama, breathing techniques, like meditation, Wim Hof breathing. All the different kinds of breathing techniques that you can learn are something that you can do with other people if you want to, or maybe you're doing them already and you kind of feel like, I think I can do this better, and why is that? So basically, if you have if you're in a specific state already, whether that's a physical, emotional, psychological, you are bringing that state to everything you do. So if you want to improve something like breathing mechanics, you have to look at some of the contexts in which we breathe. So I've written down some of the contexts. Breathing depends on things like your state of mind. So are you relaxed or are you anxious, for example? Your state of fitness, if you're active or sedentary. Your activity, so if you're sitting or standing or walking or running. The level of that activity, if it's a gentle or intense level of activity. So if you're walking down a street, or if you're hiking up a mountain, that's going to be a very different way of breathing. The environment will affect your breathing. So whether it's the weather, the geography, or the altitude. And it also depends on the literal shape of your body. So by that, I don't mean, if you're apple-shaped or pear-shaped or in shape. I just mean like literally the position you're in. So if you have a hyperkyphosis, which is an excessive curvature of your upper spine, a scoliosis, if you always carry something in one arm, like a male person, for example, would breathe differently because they're always carrying a lot of heavy, baggage or a load on one side. So your spine and your torso, if it's altered in shape, will affect your breathing. And then there's a context of your breathing parts relative to the other parts of your body. So your rib cage relative to your pelvis and your shoulders and your head and neck. So for today, I've identified, I think 4 alignment points, maybe 3 or 4 alignment points, and about 6 exercises. So you will get a recording of this, I hope. And then you'll be able to write those down or practice them. And hopefully that will be enough to start you on your journey of better breathing mechanics. Okay, so we'll start with the first alignment point. But before we do that, I want to kind of establish a baseline. And I'm not doing this in terms of like being able to compare now versus an hour and a half from now, like, is it any better? Because it's a bit of a magic trick when people do that, by the way. Like if somebody says, like, let's do a forward bend, and then, we'll do these fascial stretches or something, and then we'll do the forward bend again, and then isn't that better? Frankly, anytime you do something the second time, it's usually better. Unless you've injured yourself doing it the first time, it's usually better. And you can pretty much do anything at all, and it will be better. So it's called the placebo effect, right? If you tell somebody, bend forward, do a hip hinge, and now scratch your head and spread your toes, and then repeat it, and it's like, wow, it's better. So it's kind of leading the witness. So when I do a context breathing, it's more in terms of like just awareness. Like, let's bring awareness to how we're breathing now, what's moving, and what's not moving. Okay, so for about 2 minutes, we're just going to sit quietly. I'm going to probably sit in a chair, it's just easier. And then I'll time it and we'll take a breath. So if you want to actually write down some of these things, you can, but you don't have to. You can just use your mental notebook and just notice some of the things that you notice if you're breathing quietly in a seated position. So you don't have to like change anything you're doing. You don't have to sit differently or sit in a way you think is proper or anything like that. Okay. So let's start now. It's 1:12. So I'll stop us at about 1:14 or 1:15, and we'll just notice some of the things you do. So if we spend the next 2 or 3 minutes breathing, and I won't talk all the way through it, I'll let you kind of notice yourself. Notice things like, are you breathing differently in one place than another? Or is all your breath the same? Do you breathe in through your nose? You can notice things like, where's the weight? If you're sitting down on your sit bones, if you're standing, which foot, which part of which foot? Do you feel collapsed on one side, shorter or longer on one side? Are you aware of the breath entering the nasal passages? And do you feel it traveling through your throat? And which part of your body moves? Do you feel there's an effort to that? Or is it easy? So basically, if you were just sitting watching TV or not really thinking about your breathing, but then suddenly you were, if you feel like fussing or moving, go ahead and do that, but then go right back to noticing your breathing. Is there a space between your exhale and your inhale? Let's do this for another 20 seconds. Okay. All right. Did you get some information about your breathing? That you could make a little mental list of some of the things that you noticed? So now we're going to start by looking a little bit at an alignment point that some of you will be familiar with and some of you won't. And this is ribs, a rib position alignment point. So we're going to talk about the primary breathing muscle is the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle that is, it is basically the floor of your rib cage. It's also the ceiling of your abdominal cavity. And because it's the floor of the rib cage and ceiling of your abdominal cavity, it can affect the pressure system in both of those cavities. Not that those are like cavities. they're called cavities, but of course they're filled with stuff, right? So they're not really cavernous. Now, the diaphragm being a dome shape, the interesting thing about a diaphragm that I learned recently through a podcast is that only mammals have one, and I didn't know that. So because our primary muscle, breathing muscle, is the diaphragm, when it contracts, so it's dome shaped under the bottom of your rib cage, and that's in its relaxed position. And when it contracts, it moves downwards. So it almost seems counterintuitive to me in terms of muscle effort, because it's moving, it efforts into gravity and releases away from gravity into relaxation. So in its contraction, it moves down and it creates a vacuum, or it increases the, I guess it would be decreases the pressure system in the lungs, which then draws air into the lungs. Being at the bottom of the rib cage and attaching to the bottom of the rib cage, the position of the rib cage is going to affect the position of the diaphragm. So most of us, and I'm going to do this sitting and standing, and I'll turn to the side to begin with, but most of us are sitting and standing in a way where the bottom of the ribs is slightly lifted in the front and slightly dropped in the back. So if I had a ring around the bottom of my rib cage right now, the ring at this point is parallel to the floor, and at this point, it is closer to the floor in the back and further from the floor in the front. Does everybody follow me so far? So what most people are doing to stand in a good, what they perceive as good posture, is this chest up, shoulders back position where the ribs are lifted in the front. So that affects not only the position of the diaphragm, because now it's lifted here, but it affects the length of the front of my abdomen, my abdominal muscles, and we'll get to those a bit later. So what I'm going to have everyone do is just find the front of their rib cage, and just with your flat of your hand, just kind of palpate under your bra strap area. I think everyone here is women, so we can say bra strap and everyone will know what that means. And you'll feel kind of a more prominent rib usually. And so it doesn't have to be like your literal bottom rib, it can be just in that area. So most of us can kind of feel the ribs kind of come up towards the breastbone in an A shape, right? So in that corner right there, I'm going to take your hands in that corner, and then you can wrap your hands around your rib cage with your thumb in the back, or you can put your hands in front of you if you prefer, and then just drop your rib cage down until the front of the ribs is stacked right over the top of your pelvis, right? So if you had that ring, it would be parallel to the floor. So if you look at my head for a moment, I'm going to show you ribs up, chest up, shoulders back. And at the moment, if you dropped a plumb line from my ear, it would probably go right through my shoulder and into my hip. So that's what most people would consider kind of good posture. Now, when I drop my ribs, you'll see that my head and shoulders move forward, which is why most people kind of consider this not good posture. But in terms of our diaphragm, the diaphragm's in a better position to generate force, or it's in a position where it can be optimized, its strength can be optimized, okay? So it can contract in this position much better than it can in this position, because everything that it generates force on, which is the ribs, the bones of the rib cage and the spine, are in a different shape than they would be than if they were neutral. So this is rib cage neutral. It is diaphragm neutral, but it may not be head and shoulder and neck and head neutral. So we'll get there. But what this does is exposes the fact that my head and shoulders are in front of me all the time. So when I lift my rib cage, I don't need to change the position of my head and neck. So the vertebra of my neck doesn't change. The position of my head relative to my neck doesn't change. The entire shape of my rib cage doesn't change. It just gets tilted. So you can see that when I go back and forth between one and the other, that I'm not actually moving joints of my head and neck. I'm just moving a very small part of my spine, which is kind of mid-spine, bottom ribs, top of the lower back. Does everybody follow so far? So when I drop the ribs down, even though it looks, not ideal, and it might not feel ideal to you, I want you to start breathing in this position because this is diaphragm neutral. And we have to address what's happening with the head and neck and shoulders at some point. But it's kind of a little bit more work than we can do in an hour and a half. We need about a year and a half to do that work. So we will definitely do some alignment points that affect it, but it's not going to get fixed in an hour and a half, okay? So now I want you to take, let's do another minute, let's say, of that breathing with the ribs in neutral, and you're in a seated position. If you're in a chair, it's probably not a great idea to be leaning back on the back of the chair. So if you're in a chair or hard chair, just come to the front of it so that your sit bones are right at the front edge and you're not leaning against it. Drop the ribs down, never mind where the head and shoulders go. And then in this position, take a few breaths. So we're just at 122, we'll go to 123. And you could notice things like if you have that last list in your head, you can compare to that list, but you can also notice things like, do you have access to different parts of your body? Or do you feel like you can expand more in some areas that you couldn't before? Maybe if this position is unusual or uncomfortable or unfamiliar to you, you will have a different experience. Maybe it will feel less optimal, depending on what strategy you were using for breathing before. Okay. All right. So that's the first one. We're going to do this standing as well because it's a little different sitting than standing. I chose to do it seated to begin with because it's generally easier to do ribs down seated. And most of us, if we're spending a lot of time in a chair, we'll be able to drop our ribs and breathe more easily. So let's come up to standing. I will just move this chair out of the frame, I think. Okay. So when you're dropping your ribs standing, I'm going to stand with my back to this wall, or sorry, with my side to this wall, so you can see me in a side view. So if I'm standing and I'm looking straight ahead with my eyes at the horizon line, for the most part, my pelvis is forward and my shoulders are back. So again, there's that ribs lifted position with the ear, shoulder, and hip kind of in alignment in terms of a plumb line, but not necessarily in alignment in terms of neutral, this and that. So I'm going to back my hips up so that my leg is vertical, right? So my hip isn't forward. If you dropped a plumb line from my hip right now, it would kind of hit the ball of my foot. I'm going to back up my hips until, there she is, until my hip is over my ankle. So if you were to carry a weight over your shoulders, such as a 12-pound cat, then the weight is being borne by the whole body, right? And not just into your lower back. Now, I'm going to drop the ribs. So again, that makes my shoulders go forward and the head go forward. And we'll do the breathing there. Hi, Mushi. Are you helping? See, the thing about creating a ribs down, shoulders, head and shoulders forward is it kind of gives the cat somewhere to sit. But soon enough, I'm going to mobilize my thoracic spine and she'll have to jump off. Okay, so that's ribs down, seated and standing. And now we're going to add the head. So I'm going to have to get my cat off. Lucy. Thank you. Okay. So with the hips back, now that might look like my upper body is in front of me, but it's in front of me here too, right? It's just my hips are moving relative to my head and shoulders. So if I bring my hips back so that my legs are vertical, it might mean that my upper body is a little forward. So the ribs are down, and now I'm going to ramp my head. So I'm going to move my head into backspace, up and back. One of the ways I really like doing this is with a block. So if I have a block, I'm going to show you on the chair. If I put a block between, again, that bra strap area, this is not the best chair for this because the chair seat is kind of sloped. But if I put a block there, and I'll show you against the wall as well, I want to ramp my head in a way. I'll do it in a kind of the way that I don't want you to do it. You'll see what happens. If I put my head back in space, but I let my ribs come forward, the block, usually I lose the block, but it's stuck against my shoulder. But you can see it moving, right? So I need to keep my trunk against the block and then ramp my head back. So I want to think almost like I'm going to slide the head backwards, but also drop the chin downwards slightly. So there's a little bit of a spin in the head where the head moves down in the front and up in the back when I bring my head back, but it's not involved with this movement, right? Because that can also bring my head back, as we discussed earlier, the ear over the shoulder, but I'm kind of tilting my diaphragm up in order to do that. So I'm going to keep the diaphragm at that parallel to the floor position and then slide my head back at the same time. To do this standing, it works a lot better against the wall, and I think you'll be able to see it in the mirror. If I put a block there, you can kind of see that in the mirror. If I put the block against the wall so that my bottom, it's on my bra strap area. If I bring my head back, but I lose the block, it will fall, right? So I have to keep the bottom ribs against the block and then slide my head back at the same time. Now, the head is in biomechanics, we talk about in terms of levers and loads. And a lever is just like your arm is a lever. So if I were to hold a heavy weight out, this is an 8-pound medicine ball. If I were to hold an 8-pound weight out here, that would weigh a lot more. The mass would increase. If I brought it closer to my body, it would decrease. It's still 8 pounds, right? But the mass decreases in terms of the lever. The head is a short lever. It can only affect a few vertebrae. It can affect the neck and the upper thoracic spine. So if I'm just going to kneel for this, if I'm in this ribs down position and my head is forward, by sliding my head up and back, I'm starting to affect the curvature in the upper back, which starts to bring the upper ribs more into a vertical placement, right, as opposed to tilted forward in this position. So that's called the hyperkyphosis. We're trying to change the hyperkyphosis so that our upper back is a little bit more neutral. So the head ramp, while it won't bring you out of hyperkyphosis 100%, is definitely part of the beginning of doing that. So dropping the ribs, ramping the head, and then just take a breath there. A breath or 3. Okay. We've got one more alignment point, and that has to do with the shoulders. So we've got a shoulder girdle sitting on the rib cage, and the shoulder girdle involves two shoulder blades, right, which are called the scapulas. And the shoulder blades have muscular attachments onto the thoracic spine, which is the part of your spine associated with the rib cage. So those muscles are, I'm going to take this off. I wonder if I can take this off without throwing my earbuds out of my ears. Your shoulder blades are going to be affected passively, there we go, by the position of your rib cage. So if my rib cage is lifted in the way that we often kind of associate with good posture, the shoulder blades will become closer together passively, right? So you can try that yourself. Just drop your ribs, kind of roll your chest down, and then lift your ribs, and you'll feel your even though my arms aren't moving in space, they kind of move relative to my body. So you can see my arms moving in front of me and then beside me, okay? So what's actually happening there is as the rib cage moves under the shoulder blades get closer and further apart. It's that might be something that you need to see, but what happens when you lift your rib cage is the muscles that attach the shoulder blades to the spine become shorter, but they're not actually contracted, they're not strengthening. They're just shorter at resting length. So they no longer have a stabilizing effect on the thoracic spine. And if you can stabilize the thoracic spine, then the rib cage, each individual rib can move in its joint because the ribs are jointed at the vertebrae. Okay, so each rib has more than one joint actually on a vertebra, and then one above it, one above and one below. Two vertebrae are affected by each rib, and that's where they have a true joint. And then they come around to the front of the body, and they're attached to the breastbone with cartilage. And the cartilage has some movement, particularly if you maintain your bone's density and the health of your bone tissues. It become a little more brittle, a little harder as we age. So we're really dependent on the ability of our ribs to move at the spine. But if the spine is not being stabilized, then the ribs have less leverage, okay? So we need to get the shoulder blades sitting in neutral. Part of that is dropping the ribs, that will help. And the other part is just moving the shoulder blades apart. So what you can do is, if you're able to, just take one hand over behind your back and see if you can feel the inside edge of your shoulder blade. Okay, so that's not, depending on how your shoulders are, if you're really tight in your shoulders, you might not be able to touch that. But you can usually feel, there's one right there, the pokey bit sticking out. So let me show you quickly what I'm asking you to feel. Okay, can you see that? So this is the shoulder blade, and this is the edge here that I'm asking you to feel, the one that's closest to the spine. So there's muscles that attach these vertebrae here, these parts that stick out, to this bone right here. And see if you can feel it, because if your rib cage is lifted, you'll be able to feel it sticking out more than if your rib cage is down, right? The shoulder blade itself is kind of curved, and it sits on a curved surface. So if the curved surface moves under it, it either they're either making a nice solid connection, or there's space between the vertebra, the scapula or the shoulder blade and the rib cage. So see if you can feel that, and then with your ribs down, or you can even do something like give yourself a little hug and reach your elbows forward so your shoulder blades move apart again. And then try to take a breath or three there. Okay. So let's just review. We've got ribs down, standing or seated, head ramp, scapula wide. Okay, so I guess that's not 4. Why do I have 4? I put a number in front of the baseline breathing. So there's really 3 alignment points. Ribs down, it's even easier to remember. Head up and back, and shoulder blades wide. Okay, so why don't I take a little break here, and we'll see if we have any. There's one chat, and we'll just see if there's any questions. You can unmute. Mary Pat says, I find while standing, backing up my hips and going into diaphragm neutral, my weight is on my heels and toes. Yeah, that's correct. The weight on your feet will change when you are backing your leg up to neutral. Your weight will be over the back of your foot and not the forefoot. So it might just be that you feel a little unbalanced to begin with. So you can do it seated, or you can do it with a wall behind you. Because if this is how you're used to standing, I'm going to exaggerate so it's really obvious. And most people have a turned out foot, and their pelvis is out in front of them, and their shoulders are back like this. And if that's kind of how you are used to organizing your masses, meaning your head, rib cage, pelvis, and your legs, then backing your weight up is going to feel almost like you're falling backwards, right? So you've got weight in the back of your feet, your toes are kind of lifting. But basically, when you're in this position, you're using the front of your body to stand. And when you're in this position, you're using more of the back of the body to stand, which is really what should be holding you up. Do we have any other questions? Why is shoulder blades wide the desirable position? So shoulder blades wide, what I'm looking for is neutral shoulder blades. All right, so there's shoulder blades can do a few things. They can do a lot of things. They're really skilled. But what we're looking for here is this movement versus this movement. So this moving your shoulder blades together is called retraction, and moving them apart is called protraction. So if you move your shoulder blades apart as far as you can, most people, if they've been in the habit of lifting the rib cage in their chest, can only protract their shoulder blades to neutral. They don't actually have true protraction, because the muscles that I talked about that attach the shoulder blade to the spine have adaptively shortened. They become, their resting length is shorter than it should be. So we're going to do an exercise later, pretty soon actually, that involves lengthening the shoulder blades and getting that, it's called the medial border, the inside edge of the shoulder blade, which should run parallel to the spine at rest, a little wider from the spine. And then, because if your resting length is too short, then the muscles between that part of your shoulder blade and the spine are going to allow kind of even though it looks like your chest is lifted, there's no stability to that part of the spine that the muscle attaches to. So by taking the shoulder blades apart, you think of it like a guy wire between one bone and your spine. If you're moving that bone closer, the guy wire has it's the word I want. It's a really easy word. It has somebody help me out here. It has, it's not laxity. So you scared me.
Flat.
Yeah, it's slackened, right? So if you pull it away, it's going to create the tension on those 2 points, between those 2 points, which helps stabilize them. So, you can even think like a tent pole. When you have a tent pole, you want lines from either side going, and then you put the posts in the ground. If one post is down, then it becomes unstable, right? And it falls to the other side. Or if you have both of them down, which is what's happening with the shoulder blades together, is that the tent pole can kind of move all willy-nilly. So in order for it to have its stability so that it can create tension on the tent, then we need, those guy wires to be not tight, but stable, like stabilizing. So there's an image. Does that help? whoever asked that question. Okay, yeah. Any other questions? Susan, do you have a question?
I have a comment
Okay.
that when I noticed the difference from sitting without remembering to keep my ribs down, the first exercise, my mid back hurt the whole entire time. Ribs down, totally gone. And I feel as if there's more space to breathe.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and I mentioned that not everyone will have that experience, because if this is your current strategy, then the tendency is that you will breathe more into the chest than the back, because of that lack of if you don't have that stability on your rib cage and that lack of leverage for the muscles to act of your rib cage to act on, then you may be forced to create a different strategy for breathing, right? So you might breathe more this way. Okay. Now your ribs, your spine really shouldn't move when you're breathing. In a context of sitting quietly, I will put it that way, because of course your spine is going to have to move in different contexts. So let's say you're climbing a mountain and you're just gasping for air, right? You're going to take everything, because you're going to use all the accessory muscles as well as the primary breathing muscles. But normally when we're just sitting quietly, which is kind of my beef when it comes to a lot of the breath work that people practice, is that breath work is done out of context, right? So you're being taught how to breathe in a way that normally sitting quietly in a yoga studio wouldn't require. So your body is going like, whoa, what's going on? But normally, if your rib cage is neutral and your lumbar spine is neutral and your head is ramped, the breath shouldn't move your spine in this way. Right? What should happen is every time the ribs move, the space between each vertebra expands. So you'll actually expand in a three-dimensional way, but in this, if I expand only in this way, that's called the sagittal plane. I'm moving into extension and then flexion every time I inhale and exhale. But what I should be doing is just expanding all the way around, which actually makes me a little taller every time I breathe, because the space between each vertebra is increasing exponentially. It's just a few degrees, right? Okay, just check the chat for one more. Slack, thank you. Sometimes when I can't find words, it's because I'm dehydrated, so I'll just take a drink and then we'll continue. Okay. So let's talk about active versus passive breathing, speaking of context. Passive breathing, I spoke about the diaphragm and how mammals have a diaphragm and other beings like amphibians do not. So what happens with us when we have a diaphragm, the inhale is active and the exhale is passive. Right? So your diaphragm is contracting for you to inhale, it's relaxing for you to exhale. And that's the opposite of things like amphibians, who have to actively exhale in order to inhale. So we actively, did I get that wrong? We actively inhale and passively exhale. And amphibians actively exhale and passively inhale. Okay, so most of the time when we exhale, if we're breathing passively, so if we're just sitting doing, very little, the breath will leave because of the passive recoil of the diaphragm into a relaxed state. But we can override that and become active exhalers by using the muscles of our abdomen and some of the muscles of our rib cage. So we basically have the muscles between our ribs. There's two layers. And depending on the direction that those layers go, some of them are active on inhale and some of them are active on the exhale. So they're called the intercostals, meaning they're between the ribs. And as an active exhale, we can work to create a better inhale, basically. So we're going to do this exercise on all fours, and this is where you may want to bolster your knees if you're not comfortable being on your knees. So you can just put a blanket under your knees if you like that. And what I'm going to do is just establish what we call a quadruped position. So I'm on all fours, hands and knees. And in this position, my spine is no longer vertically loaded in gravity. So I'm just going to let gravity take my spine towards the floor and just let it sink. And you'll feel your shoulder blades come together too. Okay, so I'll just wait until everyone catches up and does a little kind of a nice letting go. Okay. Now I'm going to push my hands into the floor so that my rib cage moves up towards the spine, towards the ceiling a little bit. But I'm going to try and do that without rounding my back, right? So I'm still kind of sagging towards the ground. Push your hands into the floor, let your rib cage lift up towards the ceiling. And then in this position, I want to try and get my ribs down. So I'm going to just hold this position now and come to standing so you can see that if I don't change anything, I'm in that ribs uplifted position, right? That's where I am here when I do this. So I have to bring my ribs down, but when I'm on all fours, the ribs down looks like that. Okay, so I'm still bringing the front of my ribs down towards my pelvis. And I want to try and do that as best as I can without moving my pelvis too. That might be something that you need to practice. So if you have a mirror, you can see if you're moving your rib cage and your pelvis or just your rib cage. So I'm going to bring my rib cage down. And now I'm kind of facing the ground. You can lengthen the back of your head, back of your neck. You can even ramp your head here by pushing your head upwards. Gently, always gently, never with force. Try to get my hair out of the way. Is my sound still okay? Testing, testing. Still good? Okay. I knocked one of my AirPods out. Okay, so the ribs are up, the lower back is relaxed, my head, the back of my neck is long, and I'm going to take a breath here. So breathing in and breathing out. You can breathe in and out through your nose, or you can breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth if you prefer. And now we're going to do a more active exhale. So inhale through your nose. And as you exhale, I want you to blow straight down. And a whooshing sound until all the air is, you can get as much air as possible. And you should be able to feel your abdominal wall contract. All right, and your rib cage maybe even decrease its circumference. So inhale through the nose and exhale through the mouth. Let's do one more. Okay, so you can take a break off your hands, just come to sitting if you want to sit in your cross-legged position or on the floor in any comfortable way. So that's the difference between an active and a passive exhale. But now I want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of that exhale and how, no, actually it's an inhale. I want to talk about an inhale and how we're drawing the air in, because sometimes our active inhale is, well, I think it can be optimized or just created a different way. So let's talk about that. Take an inhale as you normally do, but think about getting as much volume as you can possibly get into your lungs. Fill it up until it's, you could not take any more air in, and then just let it out. And just do that a few times so that you're satisfied that you have as much air as you possibly can get. And when you're doing that kind of breathing, what moves in your body? What moves first? What moves the most? And if you get a little dizzy, just go back to normal breathing. Okay, some of you might have seen on my Instagram the other day that I posted a picture of myself with a feather on my nose. So I don't know where that feather went. It's probably in a corner somewhere, dust bunny under something. So we just have to imagine a feather. But I want you to imagine if you had a feather, either holding it in front of your nose or just sitting on the tip of your nose. When you did that breath that you just did, what happened to the feather? So I'm going to do that breath one more time, and you can imagine the feather would have got sucked probably right down my nose, right? So now I want you to imagine it's a little white downy feather, right? Like a fluffy feather. And I want you to breathe in such a way that you do not suck it down your nostrils. But you're still maximizing as much as you can the volume. Try that with your ribs down. Try it with a head ramp. Do you find you breathe a little differently when you're thinking that way? So when I breathe the way that it's like, get as much air in as you can, the sucking the feather in way, like you can hear it, right? I'm breathing much more nasally. The breath comes into the chest first. What moves first and what moves most tends to be the upper rib cage. I tend to emphasize a lot of neck musculature, which is a legitimate way to breathe, but it's accessory, right? It shouldn't be the initial way to breathe. So when I breathe with the down feather in front of my nose, what happens is the breathing is much quieter, but it's also much deeper. And what moves initially and the most tends to be more the bottom ribs. So put your hands on your bottom ribs again. Make sure the ribs are down, right? That ring is horizontal. Ramp your head if you want to try to create some leverage on the upper thoracic spine. And then if you want to try to create some leverage on the mid-thoracic spine, when you have your hands there, think you can even put your hands on the opposite hand on your rib cage so that your shoulder blades are a little wider. And then go back to the down feather breath. Okay, so that's what I would call diaphragmatic breathing. And it's also what I would probably, what people, when they say belly breath, are actually mean. Because if you're breathing into your belly and this is happening, that's not really breath mechanics, right? That's pressure, that's abdominal pressure. And it has nothing really to do with maximizing your breath mechanics. As a matter of fact, just doing that breath a few times made my head dizzy. So I'm going to go back to ribs down, head ramped, shoulder blades wide. And now as I breathe into that bottom of my rib cage and expand all the way around in that three-dimensional way, because the diaphragm is descending when I inhale, it is moving downwards into the abdominal cavity. Now, the diaphragm only moves down a short bit. I've seen different averages, but I'm going to say that the average is between 1/2 and 2/3 of an inch. That's how far your diaphragm moves on the inhale versus the exhale. It's not very much, right? It feels a lot bigger, doesn't it? Especially when you breathe in that down feather way. It feels like my diaphragm is moving down like 3 inches as opposed to only 1/2 an inch. But all of that movement comes from the ability of the ribs to move independently and as a whole, and then each vertebra to move, and then, taking in all that expansion into my lungs and increasing the air. So it's movement everywhere. It's not just movement downwards. Okay, let's go on to our next exercise. We're going to come back to the quadruped position. And let's just relax the spine to the ground again. Bring the bottom ribs up. Push the floor away. I know we did that in a different order last time, but it's okay. You can do it in any order. Lengthen the back of the neck. Ramp the head. And let's try the feather breath here. So inhale. And we can breathe more actively on the exhale through the mouth, straight down. So that we're using our muscles of expiration, and then inhale. And one more through the mouth, active expiration or exhalation, if you prefer. Okay. I like to tuck my toes under for this exercise. And what you're going to do is reach one hand forward as far as you can without shifting forward, right? So I'm keeping my trunk where it is and just reaching that one arm forward. So it goes forward about this far. And then I'm going to take the other hand and do the same thing. So now I've got my hands way out in front of me, and I'm going to lean back, shift back so that my arms move relative to my trunk, they move upwards. Lengthen the back of the neck. Try not to round the spine, so you're maintaining as much as you can the lumbar spine neutral curve. And take a few breaths there. And this is a position that we call, it's the beginning of thoracic stretch. Again, breathing deeply. Using that feather method. You can inhale you can exhale passively or actively. Or you can try both. And notice how this position affects your breathing. All right, we'll come to sitting there as well. So we talked a little bit about how the shoulder blade affects breathing mechanics in terms of the tension of it's called the rhomboid muscle. So the position of the shoulder blade relative to the spine is important. When you're bringing your arm overhead, the rib cage, the shoulder blade actually changes its position relative to the rib cage and tends to flatten it a little bit. So if you're excessively curved forward when you drop your ribs, you're going to find raising your arm very difficult without lifting the ribs as well. So the ribs stay down, the arm comes up only as high as it can. All right, so if that's your position when you come into I think it's here. In other words, you won't have your trunk as close to the ground. All right, and then, but that's another context in which we need to learn to breathe, because the shoulder blades start to lengthen the thoracic curve out. So we're going to go into that position in a different way in a minute. But first we'll do the rhomboid push-up on our quadruped. So come back to your quadruped. And now we're going to do kind of a classic restorative exercise called the rhomboid push-up. So you're going to start by finding the distance between the heel of your hand and your knees that allows your whole spine to be long. So I find sometimes people tend to put their hands a little closer to their knees than they should, because obviously my spine is much longer than this, right? So walk your hands out and make sure you've got lots of space between your hands and your knees. And then let gravity take your lower back to the ground. So if you had something heavy, like this 8-pound weight, I can barely lift it there, in your lower back, right? It's going to sink towards the ground, and try not to lift it around your lower back. But at the same time, bring your ribs up, right? Which doesn't involve moving the pelvis. Sorry, I should have said ribs down. Bring your ribs down so your diaphragm hoop is now vertical. And then rotate your elbows so that if you bent your elbows, they'd be pointing straight back, and the inside of your elbow would be pointing straight forward. And you're going to push the floor away, lengthen the back of your neck. Let gravity take your rib cage down. So I think of it like the rib cage moving down the inside of the upper arm. And then push the floor away again. So this movement is a movement of the shoulder blades relative to the rib cage. All right, so I'm just gonna move this so it doesn't crash. And what this movement is not is a movement of the spine. So let me show you the movement of the spine that most people associate with this exercise is extension and flexion of the spine. So in this case, we have a neutral spine, and the rib cage is just moving relative to the ground because the shoulder blades are coming together and apart. Okay, you just do that several times. And then push the floor away as far away as you can without rounding your back. You're not making a hunchback. And then push the floor away, lengthen the back of the neck, just hold that, ramp your head, hold that position, and do your breath there. And again, it might not be that suddenly you have a great breath. It might be the opposite, in fact, because now you're accessing areas of your body that may not have moved this way, or may not have had to move this way in order for you to breathe. All right, so we're accessing. Remember, restorative exercise is all about finding areas of our body that aren't moving, that should be moving to complete this task. Keep the back of the neck long. And usually the wrists are the things that the limiting factor here. So if your wrists get tired, just come into a sitting position and take a break. So sometimes you'll be in a class and someone will say, take a big breath or take a deep breath. And I've always felt that wasn't detailed enough. Like it wasn't specific enough for me. I need to know what kind of breath that is. So for me, a full breath is the one where, you try to just suck in as much air as you can at whatever cost in terms of the position of your spine. And a deep breath is one that moves the diaphragm. So I think of that down feather breath as a deep breath. So the next time you're in a class and somebody suggests you take a deep breath or a full breath or however they word it, see if you can use that breath and how does that affect your practice if you're practicing something. Okay, let's come up to standing, and we're going to do the thoracic stretch again. Depending on how tall you are, you can do this using your chair, or if you're really tall, you can use a wall. So I'll show you the difference because I'm really tall. If I use the chair and I try to do the standing, what happens is I can't bend enough, right? I have to kind of, it just becomes difficult in terms of getting the right position. So I'm going to use the wall. All right. Sometimes I use the back of the chair and I just do it kneeling. So sometimes in class, that's how I do that exercise. But we'll use the wall. So this is that exercise again where the arms go over your head. But make sure you can bring your arms, make sure you can determine how far your arms can go overhead without affecting your neutral rib cage diaphragm position. So if you can only get your arms overhead by going into that back bend, then you're only going to bring your arms that high, right, relative to the rest of your body. But as long as your ribs are up and you're ramping your head, wherever you can get your arms is going to start affecting the curvature of your upper back and moving some of those ribs, because those ribs might not be moving as much as we like them to be if they've been in this position for long and are actually in a hyperkyphotic position. So to do this exercise, I have to kind of step with my back to the camera, but you can probably see it in the mirror. And I'm going to start with my hands at about shoulder height, and then walk out and walk away from the wall, and then start to move my hips into the middle of the room so that I'm back in that arm overhead position. So you can maybe see from the mirror. Ribs are up, head is ramped, and I'm just going to let the weight of my body kind of sink towards the ground without letting it collapse, right? So I'm not letting my rib cage collapse or my spine collapse and my arms to go into this position. Keep my ribs down, relax my lumbar spine, just like I did in the neutral, in the quadruped. All right, if you have to, if your hamstrings are tight, bend your knees a little bit, that's fine. Now, push the wall away with your hands and think of getting that weight back, like Mary Pat suggested, back in your heels. So if you're too far away from the wall, just walk forward a bit. Try to get some weight in your heels, even if the toes are not weighted. Take a few breaths there, using that deep breath image. Keep pushing the wall away. So you're not leaning, right? If I had to, I could take my hands off the wall. Okay, and then come up to standing. All right. Now we're going to do a crescent stretch, so we can still do the standing. This is one exercise that I like to do sometimes with my back to a wall. So I'll show you in the middle of the room or on the mat, and then I'll show you that variation in case you have a wall that you can access. So I'll turn to the side so you can see this. I'm going to bring my arms up again, but remember, we're only bringing our arms up as high as we can without bringing the spine and the ribs with them. So in my case, I can bring them up almost 180 degrees. And then I'm going to, sorry, you can't see the top of my arms. I'll do this kneeling in a minute. I'm going to grasp my right wrist with my left hand, and I'm going to side bend to the left, okay? Remember to keep your legs vertical, so try not to shift your pelvis forward and your ribs up. Bring your hips back, ribs down, arms up, and then side bend. Okay. Even here, you can ramp your head. So if your head is kind of jutting forward or sticking out, slide it back. I'll get this arm out of the way. So slide it back. And with this left arm, pull your right arm up so that you're lengthening the muscle attaches there, the latissimus muscle of the back. And then breathe there. Breathe into that deep bottom of your diaphragm. Okay, come back up and relax. And we'll do the other one in a minute. So to do that against a wall, you can even use your block again if you had one. Bottom ribs are stable, head is ramped. There we go. Arms come up, and I'm going to side bend. So you basically, what happens to a lot of people when they go into a side bend is that they rotate. So now my right rib cage is no longer as close to the wall as the left. So I have to rotate back, right? So I'm staying on that frontal, it's called the frontal plane. So let's do the other side. Get your Legs vertical, ribs down, head ramped. Bring your arms up. Grab the left wrist with your right hand. Side bend to the right. With your hand, pull this arm, so you're moving the shoulder blade. Keep the head ramped and try not to twist or rotate. So if you have a wall, you can think of keeping both rib halves on the wall. The arms won't necessarily be on the wall, they're going to be forward. And just breathe there. Maybe 3 breaths in each position, and then you can bring it back up. Okay, so let's do the crescent stretch. Suddenly I'm Bugs Bunny. Let's do the, actually I think that was Elmer Fudd. Let's do the crescent stretch one more time, but this time we're going to add, just for variety and for fun, a tricep stretch. So I'm going to take my arm, my right arm up, straight up, ribs are down, bend the elbow and place the hand behind my shoulder. Now, if your shoulder mechanics don't allow that, you might find that your hand is somewhere closer to your neck. That's fine. But then take the other hand and reach over and grab your elbow and see if you can, without forcing it, just, whatever play is left in the joint, bring your elbow up a little higher. And then once you have that, you're going to side bend. It's your right arm, you're going to side bend to the left. So the arm will be beside your ear. Try not to shift your hips in opposition, right? Keep your pelvis over your feet. Side bend, we're trying to affect the upper body here. And then take a breath or 2 or 3 there. Whew. Yeah, and if this isn't in your repertoire right now, you can just, even in a chair, just kind of, lengthen one waist and see how that affects things, okay? So you don't have to do the full version of anything I'm doing here. If you need modifications, then you can just ask me later. I'll tell you. All right, let's come back up and relax, and we'll do that on the other side. So I'm going to bring the left arm up, bend the elbow, take my right hand, see if there's any range of motion in the joint easily remaining. Draw the elbow up a little higher, side bend away from that top arm. And see if you can get that deep breath versus the full breath. So remember, we're changing the shape of the spine in these last few exercises. So that's going to affect your breathing mechanics, but it's also going to require parts of your body to move more in order to access the breath. Okay, and come back up and relax it down. Okay, so we have 2 more exercises left to do. We have 15 minutes. Then we'll do a little short question and answer if you still have questions. But let's just recap the exercises so far. On your hands and knees, active breathing. Thoracic stretch, which is the arm overhead, either on your hands and knees or against the wall or on a chair. I'll show you the chair version too. Thoracic push-up, rhomboid push-up on hands and knees, and then the crescent stretch, which is what we just did. So let me show you a hands and knees thoracic stretch, because I like this one a lot. And I think some people do this version more in classes than the one on the wall. So you might find yourself doing something like this in a yoga class, for example. So I would place my hands on the chair seat, and then on my knees, just walk away, and then drop my chest between my arms. So again, because I'm hypermobile, I can kind of sink a lot deeper than that, but that doesn't really change the shape of my rib cage. It just kind of puts a lot of pressure on the ligaments of my shoulders, on the front of my shoulders. So I'm going to keep a little pressure downwards into my hands, maintaining the ribs up position, so I'm not letting it collapse. And then just breathing there, because that shoulder blade position on your rib cage will start to move the thoracic spine out of that hyperkyphotic state that we're all in. Okay, so the next few exercises are done lying on your back. And because, let me show you first of all, before you get down so that you can see the difference between somebody who lifts their ribs to stand and what happens if you drop your ribs down. So if I'm that person who lifts my ribs in order to get my shoulders back, then when I lie on the ground, it's going to look like this. I have a lot of space between the bottom rib cage and the floor, and my upper ribs are much higher than the front of my pelvis. So in order to get the ribs down here, I have to bring my head and shoulders forward, right? Because that's the ribs down position that I had standing. So I need to get something under my head that allows my ribs to be down. You might even need something under your head and shoulders. So for that, I'm going to use a half dome because it's handy, but you can use a rolled up blanket or even another mat or something folded under your shoulders. So now you can see that my ribs are down, and the bottom ribs where we identified earlier are directly over the top of my pelvis. So my diaphragm is neutral, my rib cage is neutral, my thoracic spine is not. So that's something that in order to breathe well, you will need to address. But as I said earlier, it's kind of a little bit more, hyperkyphosis is a whole different workshop. So and just once you found out how to get your ribs down, now you may need more bolster than I am showing you here. So don't be shy to try and find what you need to get your ribs down. So that's really what's going to make this exercise the most beneficial. So when your ribs are down, what you're going to do is bend your right knee and then push your right foot into the ground, lift your pelvis a little. You don't have to lift it right up or anything, just kind of drag it over to the right side of your mat. So you're back in that C curve or that crescent stretch position. And then bring your right foot off the floor. This exercise is called the abdominal twist. We're going to take the right knee across our body and bring it to the left and let the pelvis start to rotate. So it lifts, the right hip lifts off the ground. Take your right hand and put it on your bottom ribs and see if you can track the rotation through the spine until it hits your bottom ribs. So when that rib starts to lift, I want you to stop. So for me, that's right about there. Right, it still hasn't moved. If you can see that, I'm going to mark it with my finger. So right there is when it starts to move, okay? So that's where I'm going to stay. Now, at this point, you can keep your leg in the air, or if it's heavy and you don't like that feeling on your hip, you can figure out how to bolster that. So you can put it on your chair, or you can bring a couple of blocks in. Now you're going to stay here and do the feather deep breath. I'm going to do 2 of those breaths, and then I'm going to do 2 of the more active exhales. Just because I'm affecting my abdominal wall here, I'm going to try and use a little bit more abdominals for the exhales now. So inhale still deeply. And then whooshing to exhale. Inhale deeply. And exhaling actively. Okay. And then you can bring your knee back up and your foot on the floor. Center your pelvis. And if you had bolsters, you can move them over. And I'm going to do the other side. So bend your left knee, straighten your right leg. Push your right foot into the floor and drag your pelvis to the left. The reason you drag your pelvis is so that when you roll the pelvis ends up back under the middle of you, the midline. Bring the foot off the ground. You can have your arms wide and move the leg to the right. Let it lift the pelvis a little. Take your hand and place it on your bottom ribs. Now, you might be surprised at how little a rotation you get before the ribs come along. Because if you're not if you don't have the yield in your abdominal wall for a lot of twist, then you'll find the rib cage moves quickly. So try to be honest about that and just go to where you can go and then pause where the leg goes. Again, there's ways that you can modify that if you're not getting very much movement. And then wherever you get to, bolster your leg, or you can just hold it in the air if it's not too much work, and breathe there. You can do passive or active exhaling. And when you're done, bring the knee up and place the foot on the floor. Center your pelvis and stretch your legs out. So with both your legs straight, just take a moment there. Make sure your ribs are still down. If you need to adjust the things underneath you, go ahead. Find that position again where the ribs are passively down. So literally, if you put your hands on the bottom ribs and follow that around, there should be contact between the back of your rib cage and the ground here, right? And not air or space. It should be solidly resting on the floor. Bottom ribs parallel with the top of the pelvis. Now in this position, if your ribs are truly down, do you feel the back of your legs on the ground? The back of your legs meaning the back of your thighs, the middle of the back of your thighs. So I can do a little side bend, and with my fingers, I can kind of put them right underneath my thighs. There's space between the middle of the back of my thighs and the floor. So what I'm going to do next is bolster up higher until my thighs touch the ground. So for that, you can use, I'm going to just use a blanket. And let's see, I'll do blanket and maybe one of these. So this is a buckwheat pillow, but you can use, I'm trying to find things that, not necessarily equipment that you would have to buy, but something you might have at home, like blankets and bolsters and cushions and pillows. So I'm creating a bigger bolster now, and I'm going to try that. I might need this too for my head. There we go. So now if I reach down, my fingers touch the flesh. The flesh is touching the floor on the back of my thighs. And now there's actually space between the bottom ribs and the ground. Okay, so I'm no longer touching the floor from my bra strap down, is kind of floating. So this is what we call the psoas release. It affects a muscle that attaches to your bottom rib, vertebra of your bottom ribs, and runs down to your hips. And that muscle is implicated in that forward rib cage position. So it's necessary to address it if you're going to try and optimize your breathing mechanics. So we're going to spend the next few minutes doing that. And it's actually doing nothing. So I like to say doing nothing is doing something, because you might feel like you're doing nothing, but gravity is doing the work for you. So as long as there's some space here behind your bottom ribs and your legs are touching the ground. You're in a good position for this so as to lengthen, for gravity to work on lengthening that muscle and allowing the ribs to come down so that your diaphragm can work in its neutral position much more strong, with more strength. So you might have noticed through my microphones that outside of the deep or the active exhales, that every so often I take a deeper breath. And you might have noticed that in the first exercise we did, which was to sit quietly and just notice your breath for 3 minutes, that maybe not all your breaths were uniform, right? Maybe one of them was bigger, or that every once in a while you needed a bigger breath. So that's a physiological circumstance that happens naturally in your body. It's called sighing, right? And we need to sigh roughly every 5 minutes. To help move our lungs. So just stay in that position. I'm going to come up and just read through my notes to make sure I didn't forget to say anything that I wanted to say. And you can stay there for another, I'm going to give you another minute, and don't worry, I'm watching the time. And then after that, you can, when you come out of this position, you don't want to just sit bolt upright because you'll be undoing all the good work you're doing now. So when you're ready to come out of it, you want to roll onto your side and use your arms to press yourself up to sitting. So just give yourself another 45 seconds of that. There's some chat questions, so let me read them while you're just finishing up there. Okay, could you explain how to breathe without sucking in the feather one more time? Oh, your computer crashed. Oh, that's okay, I can go over it. In the crescent stretch, my low back starts to feel short. Do I back off my stretch or just try to relax the abs? Okay, that's a good one. And how would you adapt the crescent stretch for someone with a sore shoulder? Okay. All right, so let me answer these questions first. If you want to, you can roll over onto your side. So just roll off your bolsters, kind of fall off to one side and press yourself up to sitting. Good. So let's just go over the feather breath one more time. So you can imagine, or imagine like you have a tissue paper sitting at the end of your nose, and you want to breathe in a way that doesn't move the tissue paper into your nostrils, right? So you just want to quietly breathe. So it might not be the same experience for everyone, but what happens when I do that is, instead of like initially sucking, almost pulling my my nostrils closed with the breath, it almost feels like the passages expand, right? They get bigger. And the breath, because the passages are more open, the breath pours deeper into the lungs. And it moves the bottom ribs initially and the most, as opposed to the top ribs initially and the most. Does that help, Britt? And then,
Thank you. Yes, that's helpful.
Good. And then the crescent stretch, my low back starts to feel short. So it might be that when you're in the crescent stretch, can you see me? Obviously, one side is going to be short and one side is going to be long, but you don't have to work to get there because gravity is doing that, right? So you don't have to pull yourself. You don't have to pull yourself over. So one thing is just to maybe not go as far as you know, don't collapse into it, but think about more of what's happening on the top side as opposed to the bottom side. We're just decreasing the range of motion because we're not doing it really to increase range of motion of our spine as much as we are trying to increase the space between each ribs. So for adapting the crescent stretch for somebody with a sore shoulder, just do it without the arms. Just do it with, you could do it in a chair even. So that would look like this. I'll do it this way. There. So you could just, right, you could do that. Or you could hold this again. If you have one arm that is injured, you can do one arm and then the other one the other way. Or you could just do it with your arms hanging, standing, okay? I'm guessing that squeezing my butt, especially when doing the floor position, bent knee rotating is a bad thing. So are you talking about the twist when you bring your knee over? Can you just clarify? Okay. So yeah, so probably what's happening there, it's not a bad thing. It's just a strategy, right? So if you're rotating, you have to lift your butt somehow. So here's this, it can be passive, or you can kind of squeeze this glute into the ground, right? So it'd be the opposite butt muscle. Usually, so it's going to be this one now, pushes into the ground in order to get that initial lift. Is that what's happening? Or is
yes,
it just,
it is.
Yeah, it's not, yeah, I wouldn't say it's a bad thing, but if that's your strategy in getting your butt off the ground, the opposite side, then just once you are off the ground, just relax it.
Okay, thank you. That's my strategy for standing and everything else. So I'm aware.
Yeah, I was going to say if that's something that happens to you all the time, then obviously you can work on different strategies in order to get into that movement. So one of the ways that you can go into a twist without using your glutes is using you don't need to use them at all, because if you get this weight over enough, it passively pulls you. But the other thing you could do is like actively use your abdominals, but you know, that's kind of like playing around. Does anyone have any questions about modifying any other than the shoulders? Any modification requests, or were you able to do all those exercises as taught? We're good? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. We can hang out and talk a little bit longer if you need it. I don't think I need to record this part.